Find the woman who helped my father, or every one of you is finished here." The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy and final, in the glass-walled boardroom 30 floors above Manhattan, where silence suddenly felt louder than any argument that had ever taken place there, and no one moved, not the senior partners in tailored suits, not the assistants clutching tablets, not even the man who had been speaking just seconds before Ethan Whitmore walked in and ended the meeting with a single sentence. Because something in his voice wasn't anger, it was certainty, and that was far more dangerous. Ethan stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the polished wood, his gaze sweeping across the room like he already knew who had failed before anyone dared to speak, and slowly, almost deliberately, he tapped the screen of the tablet in front of him, bringing up security footage from exactly 7 days earlier, a quiet Tuesday afternoon just outside the building they were sitting in now, where a man in a simple grey coat stumbled near the curb. His steps uneven, his breath shallow, his hand reaching for balance that never came, and then he went down, not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone the world had already decided not to notice, and the footage kept rolling as people passed him by, heels clicking against the pavement, briefcases swinging, conversations continuing without interruption. One woman slowed for half a second before glancing at her watch and walking faster. A man in a navy suit stepped around him. Without breaking his phone call, the security guard near the entrance looked over, hesitated, then turned back toward the revolving door as if responsibility had a limit he wasn't paid to cross, and in the boardroom, someone shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the scene, recognizing themselves, but no one spoke, because the truth was already unfolding in front of them, frame by frame. Then the image changed, and everything about the moment shifted, because into the edge of the screen stepped a woman, Naomi Carter. No dramatic entrance, no announcement, just a pause, a stillness that separated her from everyone else, as if she had actually seen him when no one else had, and for 1 second, she stood there, her canvas bag slipping slightly on her shoulder, her eyes focused, thinking, choosing, and then she moved, crossing the distance without hesitation and kneeling beside him, her voice calm but urgent as she spoke words the camera couldn't fully capture, her hand steady as she checked his pulse, her phone already in her other hand dialing for help, her presence anchoring the moment, turning something invisible into something real, and for the first time in the footage, the man's eyes opened, just slightly, just enough to meet hers, and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or relief, but it was enough for him to hold on, enough for her to stay until the distant sound of sirens began to rise, cutting through the noise of the city that had ignored him just moments before, and then, just as quietly as she had arrived, she stepped back, blending into the movement of the street, gone before anyone thought to ask who she was. The video froze, and Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable but his voice unmistakably clear as he spoke again, slower this time, letting every word settle. "That man was my father," and the air in the room changed instantly, sharp and thin, as realization hit harder than any accusation ever could, and he let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it before adding, "And the only person who treated him like he mattered is the only person who will matter to me from this point forward." No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because every excuse felt smaller than the silence pressing down on them, and Ethan could see it in their faces, the quick calculations, the shifting eyes, the realization settling in like a slow, unavoidable weight, and finally, it was Martin Hale, the senior operations director, who cleared his throat and leaned forward just slightly as if confidence alone could rewrite what had already happened, saying, "Ethan, with all due respect, none of us knew who he was at the time," and the moment the words left his mouth, Ethan's gaze snapped to him, sharp and steady, not raised, not emotional, just precise. "That is exactly the problem," he said quietly, and the room seemed to shrink around the sentence, because there was no argument against it, no clever phrasing that could soften it, only the truth sitting there, undeniable, and Ethan stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward the window where the city stretched out below them, endless movement, endless noise, people crossing streets, cars lining up at lights, lives intersecting without ever truly touching. And for a moment, he said nothing, just watched, as if replaying something only he could see, before continuing. "He told me he could hear everything," his voice lower now, more personal, every footstep, every conversation, every second someone chose not to stop, and behind him, a few people shifted again, the discomfort no longer subtle, because now it was not just about what they did, it was about what he experienced, what he felt lying there while the world kept moving, and Ethan turned. back, his expression harder now. Do you know what he remembered most? He asked, and no one answered, not even Martin, because no one wanted to guess, and Ethan did not wait. Not the people who passed him, he said, but the one who did not, and he reached back to the table, tapping the tablet again, bringing up a still image of Naomi frozen mid-step, her head slightly tilted, her eyes focused, the moment before she chose to act. She did not ask who he was, Ethan continued, she did not check his watch, she did not wait for someone else to take responsibility, she just decided that he mattered, and the word mattered hung there, heavier than anything else he had said, because it was simple, and that made it impossible to avoid, and in the far corner of the room, a young associate named Kevin swallowed hard, his voice barely steady as he spoke. We thought someone else would help, and Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, not angry, just direct. Someone else did, he replied, and Kevin looked down immediately, the answer landing exactly where it needed to, and for a brief moment, the room was quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before, it was heavier now, filled with recognition instead of confusion, and Ethan let it sit before adding, you built your careers on anticipating risk, on seeing what others miss, on acting before it is too late, his voice rising just slightly, not loud, but enough to carry authority, but when it mattered most, when it was not about profit or reputation, but about a person right in front of you, you chose distance, and Martin opened his mouth again, perhaps to defend, perhaps to explain, but Ethan raised a hand just enough to stop him, not aggressively, just final. I am not interested in explanations, he said, I am interested in decisions, and he walked back to the table, placing both hands on its surface, leaning in just slightly, closing the distance between him and the people who now could not meet his eyes. So here is what is going to happen, he continued, his tone steady, controlled. Every contract, every pending deal involving anyone in that footage is on hold, and that got a reaction, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the end of the table, a chair shifting abruptly, because now the consequences were no longer abstract, they were immediate, tangible, real, and Ethan did not pause, and until we find her, he added, glancing once more at Naomi's image on the screen, nothing moves forward, and this time, no one interrupted, no one objected, because the direction was clear, the stakes were clear, and the message was impossible to ignore, and as Ethan straightened, his voice softened. Just slightly, but not with kindness, with certainty, because the only person in that entire moment who understood what actually mattered, he said, is the one person none of you even saw. The room did not move after that, not immediately, because the kind of order Ethan had just given did not just pause business, it rewrote the rules everyone in that room had spent years mastering, and for a few long seconds, all that could be heard was the faint hum of the city through the glass and the quiet shifting of breath as reality settled into place, until finally, it was Laura Bennett, head of communications, who spoke, her voice careful, measured. We can run facial recognition across nearby cameras, cross-reference public transit feeds, maybe even local businesses within a 1-mile radius, and Ethan nodded once, not impressed, not dismissive, just acknowledging motion, because for him, this was not about efficiency, it was about intention, and he turned slightly, glancing again at the still image of Naomi on the screen, her expression calm, unaware that a room full of powerful people were now searching for her. And for a brief moment, something softened in his gaze, not weakness, but recognition. Before he spoke again, do it, he said, but do not treat her like a lead, treat her like a person, and that distinction hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable, because everyone in that room knew how often those two things were separated in their world, and as the team began moving, phones lighting up, quiet instructions being exchanged, Ethan stepped back from the table, his attention drifting somewhere beyond the room. Somewhere quieter, somewhere personal, and without warning, the sound of a hospital monitor seemed to echo in his memory, steady and calm, and just like that, the scene shifted in his mind, back to that same night, hours after the footage ended, when he had walked into a private hospital room where his father lay resting, the city lights reflecting faintly against the window behind him, casting a soft glow across the stillness, and Daniel Whitmore had looked different there, not like the man who commanded boardrooms or negotiated million-dollar deals, but simply like a father, someone who had been reminded, even if only for a moment, how fragile control really was, and Ethan remembered standing there, unsure of what to say at first, until Daniel spoke, his voice quieter than usual, but clear. She stayed, he had said, not looking at Ethan, but at the ceiling as if replaying the moment again. Everyone else kept moving, but she stayed, and Ethan had nodded, stepping closer, pulling a chair beside the bed. "We will find her," he had replied, instinctively, because that was what he knew how to do: solve, locate, fix. But Daniel had turned his head slightly, his expression thoughtful, almost distant. "No," he said softly, "not just to thank her." And that was when Ethan paused, because there was something deeper in his father's tone, something that had nothing to do with gratitude alone. "Then why?" Ethan had asked, and Daniel had taken a slow breath, his gaze steady now. "Because she reminded me of something I forgot," he said, and the words had stayed with Ethan ever since, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a quiet truth that refused to fade. And now, back in the boardroom, that same truth shaped every decision he made, because this was no longer about a single moment on a sidewalk. It was about everything that moment revealed, about who people chose to be when no one was watching. And as the team around him worked faster, voices low but urgent, pulling data, scanning footage, building a path toward someone who had never asked to be found, Ethan remained still, watching, waiting, until Kevin spoke again from the corner, his voice more certain this time. "We have a partial match from a cafe camera 2 blocks down, time-stamped 3 minutes after the incident," and every head turned, every movement paused, and Ethan's eye sharpened instantly. "Put it on the screen," he said, and as the new footage loaded, flickering to life, the room leaned in, closer now, drawn not by obligation, but by something they had not felt before, something closer to accountability. And there she was again, Naomi, walking past the cafe window, adjusting the strap of her bag, her reflection briefly overlapping with the city behind her, and just before the frame ended, she turned her head slightly, as if sensing something, her expression unreadable, her presence undeniable. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, but carrying more weight than ever. "That is her," he said, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no hesitation in the room, no uncertainty, only a single shared understanding that finding her was no longer just a task, it was the beginning of something none of them could fully predict. "Zoom in on the corner, right there," Ethan said, his voice steady but sharper now, as the grainy cafe footage flickered across the large screen, and the room leaned forward almost in unison, drawn into a moment that felt smaller than the boardroom but somehow carried more weight than anything discussed there in years. And Kevin adjusted the frame, isolating Naomi's reflection in the glass, her figure moving past with quiet purpose, unaware that every step she took was now being studied by people who had once overlooked someone in the exact same way. And Laura stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the timestamp. "That cafe is on West 48th, she said. Thinking aloud, if she kept walking at that pace, she would have reached the subway entrance within 3 minutes, and Ethan nodded once, already ahead, already building the path in his mind. "Pull transit footage from that station between 2 and 5 minutes after this," he instructed, and the team moved faster now, not just because of his authority, but because something had shifted inside them, something harder to ignore. And as new clips began loading, flickering one after another, showing crowds descending stairs, swiping cards, disappearing into tunnels, the room filled with a quiet urgency that had nothing to do with profit or deadlines, and for a moment, it almost felt like they were searching for something more than a person, something that had been missing long before that afternoon on the sidewalk. And then, suddenly, Kevin's voice cut through, "I think I have her," and the screen froze again, this time on a clearer image. Naomi standing near a subway turnstile, reaching into her bag, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as if the world around her had not changed at all. And Ethan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the image, taking in every detail, the worn strap of her bag, the way she stood slightly to the side to let others pass, the quiet awareness in her posture, and something in that stillness struck him, because it did not match the chaos she had stepped into earlier. It spoke of someone who moved through the world without expecting recognition, without waiting for approval, and he exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, before speaking again. "Track her exit," he said, and the footage continued, showing her stepping through the turnstile, walking down the platform, and then disappearing into the arriving train, swallowed by the movement of the city once more, and the screen went still again, leaving only the reflection of the boardroom behind it, faces staring back at themselves layered over the image of someone they had yet to truly understand. And Martin shifted in his seat, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "We can request access to the train line cameras, follow her route, identify her stop," and Ethan glanced at him briefly, not dismissing, not approving, just measuring, before nodding once. Do it, he said, and as the team resumed, faster than before, more precise, more focused, Ethan stepped back again, his gaze drifting not to the screen this time, but to the memory that had not left him since that night. His father's voice, calm but certain, echoing in a way that no boardroom ever could. She reminded me of something I forgot. And Ethan understood now that it was not just about finding her, it was about understanding what that reminder truly was, because something about the way she had acted, without hesitation, without expectation, had exposed something deeper than a single moment of neglect. It had revealed a pattern, a habit, a way of moving through the world that too many people in that room had accepted without question, and now that it had been seen, it could not be unseen. And as the screen updated again, showing a new angle from inside the train, Naomi standing near the door, holding onto the rail, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, Ethan felt the weight of the search shift once more, no longer just a directive, but a quiet responsibility, and Kevin leaned forward, pointing at the screen. There, she gets off at Lexington Avenue, he said, and Ethan's eyes followed, watching as Naomi stepped off the train, merging into another crowd, another moment where she could have disappeared completely, but this time, she would not anymore, and Ethan straightened slightly, his voice calm but final as he gave the next instruction, find out where she goes next, and in that moment, no one in the room hesitated, because for the first time, they were not just following an order, they were following a truth they had all been forced to face. Pause it right there, Ethan said, and the frame froze on Naomi stepping out onto Lexington Avenue, the late afternoon light catching the edge of her face as she moved with the same quiet certainty, and for a moment, no one in the room spoke because the image felt different now, not just a clue, but a person whose life existed far beyond the edges of their screens, and Laura leaned in slightly, studying the background. That is a mixed-use block, she said. Her voice focused. Residential. Above, small businesses at street level. If she comes here often, there is a pattern, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the screen. Find it, he said, and the command was simple, but the weight behind it had shifted again, because now they were not just tracing movement, they were stepping into someone's routine, someone's world, and the team moved quickly, pulling street-level cameras, storefront angles, traffic feeds, stitching together fragments of time into something coherent. Something real, and one by one, the clips began to align, Naomi crossing the street, pausing briefly at a corner vendor, exchanging a few quiet words, then continuing down the block, her pace steady, her presence grounded in a way that stood in contrast to the urgency filling the boardroom, and Kevin pointed to a new frame as it loaded. There, he said, she turns into that building, and the image zoomed slightly, revealing a modest entrance. Clean but unremarkable, the kind of place most people would pass without noticing, and Ethan stepped closer, his gaze narrowing just slightly as he took in the details, the worn brass handle, the small directory beside the door, the reflection of the street laid over it, and something about it felt intentional, not in design, but in choice, and Martin spoke again, more carefully now. We can pull the tenant registry, cross-reference names, identify her within the hour. And Ethan turned his head just enough to acknowledge him, but did not respond immediately, because something in that approach felt incomplete, and instead, he asked, what time was this? And Kevin checked the timestamp, for 18 p.m., he replied, and Ethan nodded slowly, thinking, not about data, but about rhythm, about what came next in a person's day, and he spoke again, quieter this time. Roll the footage forward, and the clips continued, showing the building entrance from different angles as time passed, shadows stretching longer across the sidewalk, the flow of people changing, until finally, the door opened again, and Naomi stepped out, her bag still over her shoulder, but now carrying something else, a small paper container, careful in her hands, and she moved quickly this time, not rushed, but purposeful, crossing the street and heading toward a narrow side road, and Laura followed the movement on the screen, her voice softer now. She is not going home, she said, almost to herself, and Ethan's eyes stayed locked on the image. No, he replied, just as quietly, she is going somewhere that matters, and the footage shifted again, picking up her path as she turned the corner, the camera angle tighter now, more intimate, revealing a small community center tucked between two larger buildings, its sign simple, its entrance open, and Naomi stepped inside without hesitation, disappearing from view once more, and the room fell silent again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was realization, because this was not random, not incidental. It was a pattern of choices that pointed to something deeper than a single act of kindness, and Kevin spoke again, his voice different now, less analytical, more aware. "She came here right after helping him," he said, and Ethan nodded slowly, his expression steady but his tone carrying something new, something closer to understanding. "That was not the only thing she planned to do that day," he said, and as the screen held on the image of the quiet building, its open door waiting, Ethan made his next decision without hesitation. "We are not just going to find her name," he said, turning back to the room. "We are going to understand who she is," and this time, no one questioned him, because for the first time, they were beginning to see that finding Naomi Carter was not about locating a person, it was about uncovering a truth none of them had been willing to face before. "Bring up everything inside that building," Ethan said, his voice quieter now but carrying a weight that made the entire room lean in again, and Kevin hesitated for half a second before responding. "We do not have interior access yet, but we can pull public records, business filings, anything tied to that address," and Ethan gave a slight nod, not impatient, but focused, because for the first time since this began, the search was no longer abstract. It had a place, a door, a destination, and Laura stepped forward, already typing, her eye scanning rapidly as information began to populate across her screen. "It is a community outreach center," she said, reading carefully, "registered as a non-profit, small staff, limited funding, mostly volunteer-driven," and the word seemed almost out of place in the room they stood in, surrounded by glass and steel and precision, and Ethan's gaze remained steady as he absorbed it, because it confirmed something he had already begun to understand. That Naomi's actions were not isolated, they were part of something consistent, something chosen, and the screen shifted again as new images appeared, photos pulled from public listings, a modest interior, folding chairs arranged in rows, a small front desk, shelves lined with supplies, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress, just space built for purpose, and Kevin pointed to a staff listing as it loaded. "We might have something," he said, his voice careful. "There is a Naomi Carter listed here as a program coordinator," and the room stilled again, not from surprise, but from confirmation, and Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the name as if seeing it for the first time even though he had already known it. "That is her," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, only certainty, and Martin shifted slightly, his tone more restrained now. "We can contact the organization directly, set up a meeting, handle this professionally," and Ethan turned toward him slowly, his expression calm but his gaze direct. "No," he said, and the single word carried enough weight to stop any further suggestion. "We are not scheduling her like a client," he continued, "and we are not approaching this like a transaction," and the distinction landed clearly, because everyone in that room understood exactly how different that approach was from everything they had been trained to do, and Ethan looked back at the image of the building, the open doorway, the quiet space inside, and for a moment, his voice softened, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. She did not help him because she expected something in return. He said, "So we are not going to treat her like she did," and Laura nodded slightly, understanding the shift. "Then how do you want to proceed?" she asked, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because his mind had already moved beyond the room again, back to that hospital night, back to the steady sound of the monitor, his father's voice carrying a kind of truth that could not be negotiated or analyzed, and he remembered asking him, later that evening, after the first conversation had settled, "Did you try to stop her?" And Daniel had given a small, thoughtful smile, shaking his head slightly. "No," he had said, "because I knew she was not staying for me," and Ethan had paused then, not fully understanding, until Daniel added, "She was staying because that is who she is," and now, standing in the boardroom, Ethan understood completely, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, grounded in that realization. "We go there," he said, in person, and a few heads turned. Surprised not by the idea itself, but by the simplicity of it, the absence of layers, of strategy, of distance, and Kevin blinked, just slightly. "You mean, today?" he asked, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he replied, "because whatever she is doing in there right now matters more than anything happening in this room," and the statement hung there, impossible to ignore, because it shifted the value of everything they had been prioritizing, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Until Laura closed her laptop gently, her voice quieter now, but certain. "Then we should not keep her waiting," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod, turning toward the door, his hand pausing briefly on the handle as he glanced back once more at the screen, at the image of Naomi walking into that building, unaware that her choice had changed everything, and with that, he opened the door and stepped out, leaving the room behind, but taking with him something none of them could unsee anymore. The city felt different the moment Ethan stepped out of the building, not quieter, not slower, but sharper, as if every sound now carried meaning he had ignored before: the distant horns, the rhythm of footsteps, the fragments of conversation drifting through the air. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about schedules or projections or outcomes. He was thinking about a single person walking into a place no one in his world had ever noticed, and Laura kept pace beside him. Her voice low but steady. "It is a 12-minute drive at this hour, maybe 15 with traffic," and Ethan nodded without looking at her, already scanning the street as if expecting to see something familiar in a place he had passed 100 times without ever truly seeing, and Kevin followed just behind, holding his tablet but no longer using it, as if data suddenly felt less reliable than what they were about to step into. And when the car pulled up, sleek and silent against the curb, Ethan paused for half a second before getting in, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because he understood that whatever waited at the end of that drive was not something he could control, and the ride itself was quieter than any of them expected, not tense, not awkward, just reflective, the kind of silence that leaves space for thought. And as the city shifted outside the window, glass towers giving way to older buildings, bright storefronts fading into quieter blocks, Ethan found himself watching more closely, noticing details he would have ignored before: a man helping someone carry groceries across the street, a woman holding a door open for a stranger, small moments that did not make headlines, did not change markets, but somehow felt more real than anything discussed in the boardroom. And when the car finally slowed, turning onto the narrow street Kevin had pointed out earlier, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed ahead, and there it was, the building from the footage, unchanged, unremarkable, its door still open, its presence quiet but steady, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because the simplicity of it carried more weight than expected. And Ethan opened the door himself, stepping out onto the sidewalk, the air different here, less rushed, more grounded, and as Laura and Kevin joined him, he walked toward the entrance without hesitation. His steps measured, deliberate, and when he reached the door, he did not push it open immediately. Instead, he paused, just long enough to take in the sound coming from inside, voices, not loud, not chaotic, but present, layered with something that felt like purpose. And then he stepped in, and the shift was immediate, the space inside smaller than any room he had stood in that day, but filled with something that made it feel larger. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, a table lined with supplies, a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes and schedules, and people, real people, moving through the space with quiet intention. And for a second, no one noticed them, not because they were invisible, but because they were not the center of this world, and that realization settled in before anything else did. And then a voice broke through, calm, steady, familiar in a way Ethan had only heard once before: "You can set those over there." "Thank you," and Ethan turned toward it. Instantly, his eyes locking onto her, Naomi Carter, standing near a table, organizing supplies, her movements efficient but unhurried, her presence exactly as it had been on the screen, grounded, focused, and completely unaware of the impact she had already made. And for a moment, Ethan did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that this moment was not his to control. And Naomi glanced up, noticing them now, her expression neutral but attentive, not surprised, not impressed, just present, and she took a small step forward, wiping her hands lightly before speaking. "Can I help you?" And the question was simple, ordinary, but in that moment, it carried more weight than any question Ethan had been asked all day, and he took a breath, steadying himself, before answering, his voice calm but carrying something deeper now, something that had been building since the moment he saw her on that screen. "Actually," he said, "we came to find you." And Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, her expression unreadable, and then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she asked, "Why?" And in that single word, everything shifted again, because for the first time since this began, the answer was no longer about what had happened, but about what it meant. The question lingered between them, simple but precise, and for a moment Ethan did not answer, not because he did not have one, but because every answer he had prepared on the way there suddenly felt incomplete standing in front of her. And Naomi held his gaze without pressure, without expectation, just waiting, as if she had all the time in the world, even while the room around them continued moving, people sorting supplies, quiet conversations continuing, life unfolding without pause. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady but stripped of anything unnecessary, because you helped someone when no one else did, he said, and Naomi's expression did not change, not immediately, no recognition, no surprise, just a brief pause as if she was searching her memory not for importance, but for context, and then she nodded slightly, almost to herself. That happens, she replied, her tone calm, matter-of-fact, and the simplicity of it caught Laura off guard, because there was no weight in her response, no sense that what she had done was unusual, and Ethan took a small step closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance just enough to make the moment more personal. It does not happen the way it did that day, he said, and something in his voice shifted, not urgency, but clarity. You stayed, and Naomi's eyes held his for a second longer this time, and then she exhaled softly, glancing down for just a moment before looking back up. He needed someone to stay, she said, and again, the words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something rooted in understanding rather than effort, and Kevin shifted slightly behind Ethan, his voice quieter now, more respectful than before. Do you know who he was? He asked, and Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression neutral but attentive. No, she answered, and there was no hesitation, no curiosity attached to it, just the truth, and Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known, and then he said it, not as a reveal, not as a dramatic moment, but as a fact. His name is Daniel Whitmore, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition, not of status, but of connection, because Naomi had heard the name before, not in boardrooms or financial reports, but in passing, in conversations, in the way people spoke about influence without ever seeing the person behind it, and she studied Ethan for a second, her eyes narrowing just slightly as the pieces aligned. And you are, as she asked, and Ethan did not hesitate. His son, he said, and the room seemed to quiet just a little more, not because anyone had stopped what they were doing, but because something about the moment carried weight that could be felt even without context, and Naomi absorbed it without reaction. No shift in posture, no change in tone, just a small nod as if acknowledging the information but not attaching meaning to it beyond what it was, and then she spoke again, her voice just as steady as before. Is he okay? And the question landed differently than anything else that had been said, because it was not about recognition or consequence or gratitude. It was about him, about the person she had seen on the sidewalk, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift, the focus, and he answered without hesitation. Yes, he said, he is stable, he is recovering, and Naomi nodded again, a quiet release of tension that had not been visible until that moment, and she glanced briefly toward the table behind her where the small paper container she had carried earlier now sat among other items, and then back to Ethan. That is good, she said, and she meant it in a way that required nothing else, no follow-up, no acknowledgement, just the fact itself, and Ethan stood there for a moment, taking in the exchange, the way she had responded, the way none of this had shifted her in the way it would have shifted anyone else in that room upstairs, and he realized that what his father had said was true in a way he had not fully understood until now, that she had not stayed because of who his father was, she had stayed because of who she was. And Laura stepped slightly forward, her voice softer now. We wanted to thank you, she said, and Naomi gave a small, almost apologetic smile, shaking her head just slightly. You do not have to do that, she replied, and then, almost as if remembering something more important, she glanced toward the other side of the room where someone called her name quietly, and she turned back to them, her tone unchanged. If you came all this way just for that, then you should not have, she said, and the words were not dismissive, not unkind, just honest, and Ethan felt the weight of them settle, not as rejection, but as a challenge, because for the first time since this began, he understood that this was not about offering something, it was about understanding something, and Naomi took a small step back, ready to return to what she had been doing, and before she turned away, she added one more sentence, simple, direct. If he is okay, then that is enough. And in that moment, Ethan realized that everything he had brought with him into that room was not what she was going to measure him by, not his name, not his position, not even his intention, but something far simpler, something far harder to prove. Naomi turned slightly as the voice called her again from across the room, and for a moment it seemed like the conversation had already ended, like whatever bridge had formed between two completely different worlds had been crossed and closed in the same breath. But Ethan did not move, not yet, because something in what she had just said did not sit quietly. It stayed, pressing against everything he thought he understood about how people worked, about how value was measured. And as Naomi reached for the small paper container on the table, handing it gently to an older woman seated nearby, her movements careful and unhurried. Ethan noticed something he had not expected. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being observed, just intention, consistent and grounded, and Laura shifted beside him, her voice low, almost uncertain. "That is it?" she asked, not to Naomi, but to Ethan, and he did not answer immediately, because he realized the question itself came from a place that Naomi had already stepped outside of, and Kevin glanced around the room, taking in the quiet rhythm of people helping, organizing, listening, and he added softly, "She does not want anything," and Ethan finally exhaled, slow and steady, his eyes still following Naomi as she moved to another table, speaking briefly with a young man before adjusting a stack of papers, and then he spoke, not loudly, but with clarity that cut through the quiet noise around them. "That is exactly why this matters," he said, and Laura looked at him, searching his expression, because she could hear the shift but had not yet fully understood it. And Ethan turned slightly toward her, his voice calm but grounded in something deeper now. "If she wanted something, this would be simple," he continued. "We would give it, and we would move on." And Kevin nodded faintly, because that was the language they all understood, the exchange, the transaction, the resolution. But Ethan shook his head slightly, almost to himself. "But she does not," he said. And the weight of that truth settled differently than anything else had that day, and for a moment, the three of them stood there, no longer as visitors trying to solve a problem, but as observers trying to understand something they had never needed to before. And across the room, Naomi finished what she was doing and turned back toward them, her expression neutral but attentive, not impatient, not dismissive, just present again, and she walked over, stopping a few feet away, her posture relaxed but steady. "Is there something else?" she asked, and Ethan met her gaze, this time without the urgency that had brought him there, because the question had changed, and so had the answer, and he took a breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "My father wants to meet you," he said, and Naomi's expression did not shift the way most people's would have. There was no surprise, no curiosity driven by status, just a slight pause as she processed the request itself, not the person behind it, and she tilted her head slightly, considering. "Why?" she asked again, and the repetition of the question carried more weight this time, because now it was not about intention, it was about meaning, and Ethan felt that difference immediately, and he answered honestly, without adding anything unnecessary. "Because you stayed when no one else did," he said, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, her eyes steady, searching not for the right answer, but for the real one, and then she glanced briefly around the room, at the people still moving, still needing, still present in a way that did not pause for recognition, and when she looked back at him, her voice was just as calm as before. "I cannot leave right now," she said, and there was no apology in it, no hesitation, just a statement of fact, and Ethan nodded slowly, understanding immediately that this was not refusal, it was priority, and Laura shifted slightly, her voice softer now. "We can come back," she offered, but Naomi shook her head gently. "It is not about when you come back," she said, "it is about what you are coming back for," and the words landed with a clarity that none of them could ignore, because they stripped away everything except intention. And Ethan felt it, the shift again, deeper this time. Because for the first time, he understood that finding her had not been the goal, it had only been the beginning, and as Naomi stepped back once more, returning to the work she had not paused for them, Ethan stood there, watching, realizing that the next step was not his to control, but his to choose, and for the first time in a long time, he understood that the choice would define far more than the outcome. The room behind them continued moving as if nothing had changed, chairs shifting, quiet voices exchanging updates, the soft rustle of paper and fabric filling the space with a rhythm that did not wait for anyone, and yet Ethan remained still near the doorway, his eyes following Naomi as she moved from one person to another, offering help in small, precise ways that did not ask for attention, and for the first time since this began, he did not feel the need to speak immediately, because what mattered was no longer what he could say, but what he was beginning to understand, and Laura glanced at him, her voice low but thoughtful. "She is not impressed," she said, not as a criticism, but as an observation, and Ethan gave the slightest nod. His gaze steady. "She is not supposed to be," he replied, and Kevin shifted his weight beside them, looking around the room again, this time not as an outsider, but as someone trying to read a language he had never been taught, and he added quietly, "Everyone here, they already have something to do, they are not waiting for anything," and Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression calm but sharper now. "Exactly," he said, "they are not waiting." And the words carried more meaning than the moment required, because they reached beyond the room, beyond the day, into something that had shaped every decision he had made before walking in, and across the space. Naomi finished speaking with a young woman and moved toward a shelf, adjusting a row of boxes with the same careful attention she had shown on the sidewalk, and Ethan watched her for a second longer before taking a step forward, not toward her directly, but into the room itself, closing the distance between observer and participant. And Laura followed instinctively, her posture changing just slightly as she moved, less guarded, more aware, and Kevin hesitated for a brief moment before stepping in as well, and the shift was subtle but undeniable, because now they were no longer standing apart from the space, they were inside it, and a man near the table glanced up, noticing them, his expression open but curious. "You here to help?" he asked. And the question landed differently than anything else that had been said that day, because it did not come with expectation or recognition, just possibility, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but because the answer required something he had not been asked to give in a long time, and then he nodded once, simple and direct. "Yes," he said, and the man gave a small smile, gesturing toward a stack of supplies. "We could use another set of hands over there," he said, and just like that, the moment shifted again, not with tension or revelation, but with action, and Ethan moved toward the table, setting aside his jacket without thinking, his focus narrowing to the task in front of him, organizing items, passing boxes, following instructions that came not from hierarchy, but from need. And Laura joined at the other side, her movements careful at first, then more fluid as she adjusted to the pace, and Kevin stepped in as well, his tablet forgotten on a nearby chair, and across the room, Naomi noticed, not immediately, but gradually, her eyes catching the shift, the presence of three people who had arrived with purpose now choosing to stay for a different reason, and she did not interrupt, did not acknowledge it directly. She simply observed, her expression unchanged but her awareness clear, and as minutes passed, something subtle but important began to settle, not in the room itself, but in the way Ethan moved through it, the way he listened instead of directing, the way he responded instead of deciding, and for the first time since stepping into the building, he felt the difference fully, the absence of control replaced by something else, something quieter, but far more grounded, and after a while, when the immediate task slowed, Naomi approached again, her steps unhurried, her presence steady, and she stopped a few feet from him, her voice calm but carrying a different tone now, not questioning, not distant, just observant. "You stayed," she said, and Ethan looked up at her, meeting her gaze without hesitation, and this time, there was no need to explain, no need to justify, just a simple answer that matched the moment. "So did you," he replied, and for the first time since they had met, Naomi's expression shifted, just slightly, not into a smile, not into surprise, but into something that acknowledged the difference, something that recognized that the reason he had come was no longer the reason he had remained, and she gave a small nod, as if accepting that answer for what it was, and then she spoke again, her voice just as steady as before, but carrying a quiet clarity that reached deeper than anything said so far. "Now you understand why." The words settled between them, quiet but immovable, and Ethan did not respond right away because for the first time he was not trying to answer, he was trying to feel the truth behind what she had said, and around them the room continued its steady rhythm, chairs shifting, soft voices rising and falling, the kind of movement that did not demand attention but carried meaning in every small action. And Naomi held his gaze for a second longer before turning slightly, not dismissing him, not leaving the moment unfinished, but trusting it had already said what it needed to, and she moved back toward the table where a young woman was sorting through a box of supplies, offering a quiet suggestion that eased the process without interrupting it, and Ethan watched her go, not with urgency now, but with understanding that came slower and deeper than anything he had experienced that day, and Laura stepped closer to him, her voice softer than before. "I think this is what your father meant," she said, and Ethan nodded faintly, his eyes still following Naomi. "He did not mean the moment," he replied, "he meant everything around it," and Kevin glanced between them, his expression thoughtful. "It is not about what she did," he added quietly, "it is about who she is every day," and Ethan turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the point with a small nod, because that was exactly it, and the realization carried weight. Not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple it had been overlooked, and across the room, a man called out for help lifting a box, and without hesitation Ethan stepped forward again, reaching for the other side, his grip firm but controlled, and together they moved it across the space, setting it down with care, and the man gave a quick nod of thanks before moving on. No recognition, no pause, just continuation, and Ethan stood there for a moment, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the box. And something shifted again, not in the room, but in him, because he realized that none of this required acknowledgement to matter, and that thought stayed with him as he stepped back, his gaze lifting just in time to see Naomi watching him again from across the room, not evaluating, not measuring, just observing, and this time when their eyes met, there was no distance left, no need to prove anything, just recognition of a choice being made in real time, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to her work, and that was enough, more than enough, and minutes passed in that same rhythm, steady, grounded, until eventually the flow of activity began to slow, people finishing tasks, gathering their things, offering quiet thanks to one another before heading out, and the room gradually shifted into a softer silence, the kind that follows effort rather than absence, and Naomi moved toward the center, collecting a few remaining items, and Ethan approached again. This time without hesitation, stopping a respectful distance away, and when she looked up at him, her expression was the same as before, calm, present, and he spoke, not as someone making a request, but as someone sharing something real. He wants to thank you himself, he said, his voice steady, but I understand if that is not what matters to you, and Naomi studied him for a moment, not the words, but the intention behind them, and then she asked, why do you want me to meet him? And the question landed differently this time. Because now it was directed at him, not his father, and Ethan did not rush the answer, he let it form fully before speaking, because I think he needs to say it, he replied, and I think I need to understand why you did not need to hear it, and Naomi held his gaze, her expression thoughtful now, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath again, not from tension, but from the weight of something honest finally being spoken, and she exhaled softly, glancing toward the door as if measuring the time, the distance, the responsibility still waiting, and then back at him. I can come tomorrow, she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet agreement, not to a meeting, but to something deeper, something still unfolding, and Ethan nodded once, understanding the significance of what had just been offered, not as a favor, but as a continuation, and as Naomi turned to gather the last of the supplies, preparing to close the room for the day, Ethan stepped back slightly, watching, not as someone searching anymore, but as someone who had finally found the beginning of something he had not known he was missing. The evening light faded slowly through the windows as the last few people gathered their things and stepped out into the quiet street, leaving behind a softer stillness that settled into the room like a breath finally released, and Ethan stood near the doorway again, but this time he did not feel like someone arriving or searching, he felt like someone who had been allowed to see something real, and Naomi moved through the space one final time, checking the tables, aligning chairs, making sure nothing was left undone, her attention steady even in the smallest details, and Laura watched her for a moment before speaking quietly. She does not slow down when no one is watching, and Ethan nodded, his voice calm but certain, that is because she is not doing it for anyone watching, and Kevin leaned lightly against the wall, his eyes following Naomi as well. I used to think impact had to be visible to matter, he said, almost to himself, and Ethan glanced at him briefly. That is what we were taught, he replied, and the truth of that hung between them, not as blame, but as realization, and across the room Naomi lifted the last box from the table and carried it toward a small storage area, placing it carefully on the shelf before closing the door, and when she turned back, the space behind her now quiet and complete, she walked toward them again, stopping at a comfortable distance, her expression unchanged but her presence fully engaged, and Ethan spoke first this time, his voice steady, no longer carrying urgency, only clarity. Tomorrow, he said, acknowledging what had already been agreed upon, and Naomi gave a small nod. Tomorrow, she echoed, and there was no need to define the time or place in that moment, because both of them understood that it was not about scheduling, it was about intention, and Laura stepped slightly forward, her tone respectful. We can arrange transportation if that helps, she offered, and Naomi shook her head gently. I know how to get there, she replied, and again, the simplicity of her answer carried something deeper, something that did not rely on assistance or adjustment, and Ethan watched her for a second, then nodded once, accepting it without question, because he had learned enough in the past hour to know when not to add anything unnecessary, and a quiet pause settled over the space, not awkward, not unfinished, just present, and then Naomi spoke again. her voice softer now but just as steady. "He was scared," she said, and Ethan looked at her, surprised not by the statement, but by the way she said it, not as an observation, but as something she had carried with her since that moment, and she continued, "Not because of what was happening, but because no one stopped, and..." The words landed gently but firmly, and Ethan felt them fully, because they connected everything: the sidewalk, the silence, the choice, and he nodded slowly, his voice quieter now. "He told me," he said, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something she already knew, and she stepped back slightly, her attention beginning to shift toward the door, toward the next part of her evening. And Ethan understood that the moment was closing, not abruptly, not with finality, but with the same quiet intention it had begun with, and as she reached for the light switch near the wall, she paused, looking back at him one last time, and her expression held something different now, not distance, not neutrality, but a quiet recognition that something had changed, not in the room, but in him, and she spoke one final sentence before turning the lights down, her voice calm but carrying a clarity that would stay long after the room went dark. "Tomorrow is not about him," she said, "it is about what you do after you leave." And then the lights dimmed, the room settling into shadow, and Ethan stood there for a second longer, letting the words settle, understanding that what waited ahead was not a meeting, but a decision that would reach far beyond anything he had planned when he first walked into that boardroom. The street outside felt quieter than it should have, not because the city had slowed down, but because something inside Ethan had, and as the door closed behind them with a soft click, he paused on the sidewalk, the echo of Naomi's last words still settling into place, not fading, not losing weight, but expanding, and Laura stood beside him, her coat pulled slightly tighter against the evening air, her voice careful. "She did not mean just tomorrow," she said, and Ethan shook his head slightly. His gaze fixed ahead but not focused on anything in particular. "No," he replied, "she meant everything after," and Kevin exhaled slowly, glancing back at the building for a moment before turning forward again. "So what happens now?" he asked, and for the first time since the day had begun, Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer was no longer a single decision, it was a direction. And as the car pulled up quietly at the curb, he did not move toward it right away. Instead, he looked back once more at the small doorway they had just stepped through, the same doorway Naomi had walked through without hesitation, without expectation, and he realized that the difference between them was not opportunity, it was choice, and that realization stayed with him as he finally stepped into the car, the door closing behind him with a muted sound that seemed to separate two different versions of the same day, and the drive back felt different than the one before, not because the city had changed, but because he was no longer looking at it the same way. Every intersection, every passing face, every small moment carried a quiet question now, not what it was worth, but what it meant. And when they reached the building, the glass and steel rising again into view, Ethan did not rush inside. He paused at the entrance, his reflection staring back at him through the doors, and for a second, he barely recognized the man looking back, not because his position had changed, but because his perspective had. And Laura stepped up beside him, her voice low. "The board is still waiting," she said, and Ethan nodded once, pushing the door open, stepping back into the world he had left just hours before. But this time, he did not walk in the same way, his pace measured, his focus clear, and as he entered the boardroom again, the conversation stopped instantly, every face turning toward him, waiting, expecting direction, expecting resolution. And Ethan stood at the head of the table, the same place he had stood earlier, but nothing about the moment felt the same, and for a second, he let the silence settle, not as pressure, but as space, and then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying something far more grounded than authority. "All suspended contracts remain suspended," he said, and a few people shifted, the tension immediate, but he continued before anyone could respond, effective immediately, "We are redirecting resources." And Martin leaned forward slightly, his voice cautious. "Redirecting to what?" he asked, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "To what we missed," he replied, and the words landed heavier than any explanation could have, because they carried truth without needing detail, and he continued, "We are partnering with local outreach organizations, starting with the one on Lexington Avenue," and Laura glanced at him briefly, recognizing the shift fully now, and Kevin straightened slightly, understanding that this was not a gesture, it was a decision, and Martin frowned faintly. "That is not part of our current strategy," he said, and Ethan nodded once, his expression steady. "It is now," he replied, and there was no resistance left in his tone, no need to convince, because the direction was already set, and the room fell quiet again. But this time it was not uncertainty, it was adjustment, and Ethan stepped back slightly, his voice softer now, but carrying more weight than before. Tomorrow, I am bringing someone here, he said, and when she walks into this room, I want every person here to understand exactly why she matters. And no one spoke, not because they did not have questions, but because for the first time, they understood that the answer would not come from him. And as Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room one last time, he knew that what Naomi had said was true, that tomorrow was not about a meeting, it was about what came after, and for the first time, he was ready to find out what that would be.